The sledgehammer came down hard against the concrete floor of the laundry room, and Dave Chen felt the satisfying crack of breaking cement reverberate up through his arms. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2022, unseasonably warm for Beaumont, Texas, and this was supposed to be a routine renovation job. Tear out the old flooring, fix whatever plumbing issue had been causing that persistent smell, and install something new. Chen had done this kind of work 1,000 times. The second blow widened the crack. The third broke through entirely. And then the smell hit him, not the chemical odor of old sealant or the musty scent of foundation moisture. Something else entirely. Something that made Chen, a man with 15 years of renovation experience, stop mid-swing and set down his sledgehammer with hands that had suddenly gone cold. "Hold up," he told his crew, his voice tight in a way that made them all freeze. He knelt beside the broken concrete, shining his work light into the dark cavity below, and what he saw would transform this ordinary suburban home into a crime scene. What he saw would finally answer a question that had haunted Beaumont for 27 years. What happened to Jacob Pierce? Because there, wrapped in the deteriorated remains of an industrial tarp, sealed beneath inches of deliberately poured concrete, lay the skeletal remains of a man who'd been missing since October 1994, a quiet computer technician whose disappearance had destroyed an innocent friend's life, spawned a failed investigation, and allowed a killer to hide in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. But to understand how Jacob Pierce ended up buried beneath his own laundry room floor, we need to go back to a time when he was still alive. Back to when his lights flickered on every morning at precisely 6:47 a.m., back to when predictability meant safety, back to the days before everything changed. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters, manipulators, and trolls won't subscribe. If you believe people should be treated fairly, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you're not siding with the bully. Jacob Pierce was the kind of man you could set your watch by. Every morning at precisely 6:47 a.m., his neighbors would see the lights flicker on in his modest single-story home on Maple Ridge Drive, a quiet street in one of Beaumont's expanding suburban neighborhoods. By 7:15, he'd be backing his well-maintained sedan out of the driveway, heading to the tech repair firm where he'd worked for the better part of a decade. To those who knew him, Jacob wasn't just punctual, he was predictable in the most comforting way possible. At 41 years old, Jacob had carved out a life that might have seemed unremarkable to outsiders, but it was precisely the life he wanted. He worked as a computer technician during an electrifying time in American history, the early rise of the home computer era, when families were just beginning to understand that these humming beige boxes weren't just expensive curiosities, but gateways to an entirely new world. While others chased flashier careers, Jacob found genuine satisfaction in the methodical work of diagnosing problems, replacing components, and watching relief wash over customers' faces when their precious machines whirred back to life. His colleagues at the Beaumont area tech repair firm knew him as the guy who never missed a deadline, never lost his cool when faced with a particularly stubborn hard drive failure, and never failed to properly document every repair. Jacob was organized to a fault, his supervisor would later recall. He had systems for his systems. If you needed to find something in his workspace, you could, because everything had its place. This wasn't obsessive behavior. It was simply who Jacob was. In a field that often attracted brilliant but chaotic minds, Jacob stood out for his ability to bring order to technological chaos. But Jacob Pierce wasn't defined solely by circuit boards and diagnostic software. Beyond the workplace, he maintained what he considered a comfortable, if modest, social life. His home on Maple Ridge Drive reflected his personality perfectly. Clean without being sterile, organized without being austere, comfortable without being lavish. Neighbors would occasionally see him tending to his small front lawn on Saturday mornings, or carrying in groceries with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. The house itself was unassuming, a single-story structure that blended seamlessly into the neighborhood's aesthetic of post-war suburban development, where families had moved seeking safety, community, and the promise of the American dream. Living alone suited Jacob. He'd never married, never seemed particularly interested in the dating scene that some of his co-workers navigated with varying degrees of success. This wasn't antisocial behavior or isolation. Jacob simply preferred his own company most of the time, finding peace in the quiet routines that structured his days. He wasn't lonely. He was content. There's a crucial difference that those who knew him well understood implicitly. Yet Jacob wasn't a hermit. He maintained connections that mattered to him with the same dedication he brought to his professional life. Chief among these was his relationship with his sister, who had relocated out of state years earlier for her own career opportunities. Despite the distance, they spoke regularly. Phone calls that came like clockwork, usually on Sunday evenings, where they'd catch up on the week's events, share family news, and maintain the bond they'd forged growing up together. She knew her brother's patterns, his preferences, his dependability. She knew that when Jacob said he'd call, he would call. When he said he'd visit for the holidays, he'd be there. In Beaumont itself, Jacob's social anchor was a small but steady circle of friends. These weren't casual acquaintances or work connections that dissolved outside office hours. These were genuine friendships built over shared interests and consistent presence. Jacob wasn't the type to collect hundreds of superficial relationships. He invested in the few that mattered. Peter Hollis embodied this perfectly. As Jacob's longtime bowling buddy and neighbor, Peter had become perhaps the closest thing to a best friend in Jacob's adult life. Their friendship had that easy, unforced quality that develops between men who share regular activities without needing constant emotional processing. Thursday nights meant bowling league. Saturday afternoons might mean beers and conversation in one of their backyards, discussing everything from computer industry developments to the Beaumont sports teams to the quirks of their neighbors. Peter lived just 3 houses down from Jacob, close enough that they'd sometimes walk to each other's homes rather than drive. Close enough that borrowing tools or sharing extra produce from a backyard garden happened naturally. In the landscape of suburban American friendship, theirs was textbook, rooted in proximity, sustained by shared interests, deepened by time and reliability. Peter knew Jacob's habits, his preferences, his rhythms. He knew that Jacob wasn't spontaneous, that he planned his activities, that he showed up when he said he would. This predictability, this reliability, was perhaps Jacob's defining characteristic. Co-workers counted on him. His sister counted on him. Peter counted on him. In a world that often felt increasingly chaotic, even in the relatively stable environment of suburban Beaumont, Jacob Pierce represented something reassuring. Consistency. You knew where you stood with Jacob. You knew what to expect. He had no enemies. In an era and environment where workplace rivalries, neighborly disputes, and personal conflicts were hardly uncommon, Jacob had somehow navigated through life without accumulating grudges or antagonists. His quiet demeanor wasn't weakness. It was simply an absence of aggression, a lack of interest in the petty competitions and social hierarchies that consumed others. He did his work well, minded his business, treated people with basic decency, and expected little more than the same in return. His criminal record was non-existent, not just clean, but genuinely absent. Jacob had never been arrested, never been questioned by police, never even accumulated the kind of minor infractions that many people collect over a lifetime. He paid his bills on time, followed traffic laws, and lived well within the bounds of social and legal norms. He was, in every measurable way, a law-abiding citizen who contributed positively to his community without seeking recognition or reward. This was Jacob Pierce at 41, a computer technician navigating the exciting early days of the personal computing revolution A man whose life was defined by routines and reliability, who maintained his modest home with the same care he brought to repairing circuit boards, who stayed connected to the people who mattered while avoiding the drama that entangled so many others. He was quiet without being withdrawn, organized without being rigid, dependable without being dull. To those who knew him best, his sister during those Sunday phone calls, Peter over Thursday night bowling frames, his co-workers during the daily rhythm of the repair shop, Jacob was exactly what he appeared to be. There were no hidden depths of darkness, no secret double life, no Jekyll and Hyde transformation lurking beneath the methodical exterior. He was genuine in his simplicity, authentic in his ordinariness. This was the man whose lights flickered on every morning at 6:47, whose car backed out of the driveway at 7:15, whose Thursday nights were reserved for bowling, whose Sunday evenings meant calling his sister. This was Jacob Pierce, unremarkable in the most remarkable way, living a life that asked for nothing more than to continue its comfortable, predictable patterns. And then everything changed. The date October 18, 1994, would become seared into the memory of everyone who knew Jacob Pierce. Not because of what happened that day, but because of what it represented. The moment when comfortable assumptions about safety and predictability collapsed like a house of cards in a sudden wind. It started, as these things often do, with silence. Jacob's sister, whose Sunday evening phone calls with her brother had become as reliable as the changing of seasons, made the first call that set everything in motion. She'd been trying to reach Jacob for days. The first missed call hadn't worried her immediately. Perhaps he'd gone out. Perhaps he'd fallen asleep early. But when Sunday came and went without their scheduled conversation, a small seed of concern took root in her mind. Jacob didn't miss their calls. He just didn't. Monday brought no answer. Tuesday's repeated attempts went straight to an answering machine that, she would later tell police, sounded increasingly full. Jacob's outgoing message playing over and over like a recorded ghost. By Wednesday, that seed of concern had grown into genuine alarm. She called his workplace, only to learn that Jacob hadn't shown up for his shift, not Monday, not Tuesday, not Wednesday. For a man whose attendance record was impeccable, whose co-workers joked that he'd probably show up to work during a hurricane, this absence screamed wrongness louder than any explicit threat could have. On October 18, 1994, Jacob's sister made the call that would transform a personal worry into an official investigation. The Beaumont Police Department received a missing persons report for Jacob Michael Pierce, age 41, described as a quiet, reliable computer technician who had seemingly vanished from his locked home without explanation. The timeline that investigators would piece together painted an increasingly unsettling picture. The last confirmed sighting of Jacob came from his neighbors on Maple Ridge Drive, the Hendersons, an elderly couple who lived directly across the street and who, like many retirees, maintained an informal watch over the neighborhood's comings and goings. They remembered seeing Jacob 2 nights before the missing persons report was filed. It was early evening, still light enough to see clearly, and Jacob was doing something completely ordinary, unloading groceries from his car. Mrs. Henderson had even waved to him from her porch. Jacob, ever polite, had nodded back. She remembered that clearly. He'd been carrying those distinctive brown paper grocery bags, the kind that always seemed on the verge of splitting at the bottom if you weren't careful. She'd counted 3 trips from car to front door, which meant a modest shopping run, nothing excessive. Everything about the scene was utterly, completely normal. Jacob was simply doing what countless suburban Americans do multiple times per week. restocking his refrigerator and pantry, maintaining the household supplies that kept daily life functioning. Nothing about his demeanor had seemed off, Mrs. Henderson would later tell police. He hadn't looked distressed or hurried. He hadn't been glancing over his shoulder or exhibiting any behavior that, in retrospect, might have signaled danger. He was just Jacob, going through his evening routine with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. But that seemingly ordinary evening represented the last time anyone could definitively say they'd seen Jacob Pierce alive and well. The workplace angle provided another troubling piece of the puzzle. Jacob's co-workers, the same people who'd relied on his consistency for years, confirmed something unusual had occurred during that final week. Jacob had left work early, citing illness. This alone was noteworthy. Jacob rarely called in sick, and leaving mid-shift was even more unusual. The co-worker who'd spoken with him, a fellow technician named Marcus, remembered the brief exchange clearly enough to recount it for investigators. He said he wasn't feeling well, Marcus told police. Nothing specific, just that he needed to go home. He looked a little off, maybe, but I figured it was flu or something going around. He said he'd probably be back the next day. Marcus paused, the weight of hindsight heavy in his voice. That was it. That was the last thing he said to me. I'll probably be back tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. When Beaumont police officers arrived at Jacob's home on Maple Ridge Drive that October afternoon, they encountered a scene that would haunt the investigation from the very beginning. The house itself looked undisturbed from the outside. No broken windows, no kicked-in doors, no obvious signs of forced entry or violent struggle. The small lawn was neatly maintained. The exterior as unremarkable as it had always been. If you'd driven past without knowing what was happening, you'd have assumed the resident was simply away, perhaps at work or running errands. But the accumulating details told a different story. The mail had piled up, not just 1 or 2 days' worth, but enough to overflow the small mailbox mounted beside the front door. Circulars, bills, catalogs, and letters created a paper testament to absence, to a homeowner who hadn't performed the simple daily task of collecting his correspondence. For a man as organized and routine-driven as Jacob, letting mail pile up was as significant as someone else leaving their front door wide open. The officers knocked, called out, received no response. Following proper procedure and armed with the authority granted by a worried family member's missing persons report, they prepared to enter the residence. What they discovered upon reaching the door would become one of the investigation's most perplexing details. The house was locked from the inside. Not just locked, secured in a way that suggested the occupant had intentionally buttoned up the house for the night or for an extended absence. The deadbolt was engaged. The chain lock was in place. These were security measures that could only be set from within the home. The implications were immediately troubling. If Jacob had left the house, how had he locked it from the inside? And if he hadn't left, where was he? Gaining entry required breaking the locks, a process that felt intrusive even under these circumstances, as if the investigators were violating not just a physical space, but the carefully ordered life that Jacob had constructed within these walls. The door gave way, and officers entered the quiet, still home of a Jacob Pierce. The first thing that struck them, before they'd taken more than a few steps inside, was the smell. It wasn't the overwhelming stench of advanced decomposition that experienced officers knew all too well. It was something else. Strong but not quite identifiable, unpleasant but not necessarily indicating death. The odors seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper in the house, drawing the officers forward through the small living room with its neatly arranged furniture and organized shelves, past a kitchen where a few dishes sat in the drying rack beside the sink. down a short hallway toward the home's utility spaces. The smell grew stronger as they approached the laundry room. This small, functional space at the back of the house, a room that in most suburban homes serves as a catch-all for washing machines, dryers, cleaning supplies, and whatever miscellaneous items don't fit elsewhere, became the focal point of the initial investigation. The door was closed, but not locked. When officers opened it, the odor intensified immediately, filling the hallway with its unexplained presence. But the laundry room itself, when fully revealed, offered no immediate answers. The washing machine sat silent and empty. The dryer's drum contained what appeared to be a load of clothes that had been washed but never transferred to dry. Items now developing that distinctive musty smell of wet fabric left too long in a closed, damp environment. Cleaning supplies lined a small shelf in their designated places, labels facing forward with the kind of organization that perfectly matched Jacob's personality. A hamper in the corner held dirty clothes waiting for their turn in the wash cycle. Nothing explained the smell. Nothing explained Jacob's absence. Nothing explained why this ordinary room in this ordinary house felt so profoundly wrong. The officers moved through the rest of the home systematically, opening doors, checking closets, examining each room for signs of struggle, violence, hurried departure, or any clue that might explain what had happened to Jacob Pierce. His bedroom looked as though he'd simply stepped out for a moment. The bed made with military precision, clothes hanging in the closet, organized by type and color, a book on the nightstand with a bookmark roughly 3/4 through. His workspace, a small desk in the corner of the living room where Jacob apparently handled personal correspondence and bills, was typically organized. Paid bills in one stack, bills awaiting payment in another. A ledger where he tracked expenses with neat, precise handwriting. Nothing suggested financial distress or any reason Jacob might have chosen to disappear voluntarily. The bathroom toiletries were all present. Toothbrush in its holder, razor on the sink edge. Prescription bottles in the medicine cabinet with Jacob's name clearly labeled. These weren't the kinds of items someone would leave behind if they were planning to be gone for any length of time. And yet, Jacob was simply gone. The house stood as a preserved moment in time, locked from the inside, filled with an unexplained odor, containing all the physical evidence of a life interrupted mid-routine, but offering no clear answers about where that life had gone or why. October 18th, 1994, marked the official beginning of an investigation, but it really represented something else. The end of certainty. The point at which Jacob Pierce's predictable, methodical existence transformed into something far darker and more mysterious than anyone who'd known him could have imagined. The Beaumont Police Department's initial sweep of Jacob Pierce's home on October 18, 1994, marked the beginning of what would become one of the most frustrating and ultimately tragic investigations in the department's history. What started as a straightforward missing persons case would evolve into something far more complex, marked by missed opportunities, false leads, and a wrongful accusation that would destroy an innocent man's life. The crime scene, if it could even be called that at this early stage, presented investigators with a maddening paradox. Everything about the house suggested normalcy interrupted, yet nothing explained the interruption itself. The front door had been locked from the inside, secured with both deadbolt and chain. The windows were all intact, latched from within. There were no shattered picture frames, no overturned furniture, no scuff marks on the walls or floors that might indicate a struggle. Jacob's modest collection of electronics, a television, a VCR, a personal computer that represented a significant investment for the time, all sat undisturbed in their usual places. His wallet, found on the bedroom dresser, still contained cash and credit cards. If someone had broken in to harm Jacob, they'd done so without leaving any trace of forced entry. If Jacob had been attacked inside his own home, he'd apparently been subdued without any fight whatsoever. A scenario that seemed increasingly unlikely as investigators learned more about the layout and contents of the house. And if Jacob had left voluntarily, he'd done so without taking any of the items a person typically grabs when departing: wallet, keys, identification, a change of clothes. The officers methodically documented each room, photographing, measuring, noting. The living room with its well-worn couch and neatly organized bookshelf. The kitchen where that small stack of dishes suggested Jacob's last meal, perhaps breakfast, perhaps dinner, but offered no clues about what came after. The bedroom that looked ready for its occupant to return at any moment. And then there was the laundry room. That small utility space at the back of the house kept drawing investigators back, not because of what they found there, but because of what they felt there. An inexplicable wrongness that experienced officers learn to recognize even when they can't immediately articulate it. The smell that had first greeted them upon entering the house seemed strongest here. That unpleasant but not quite identifiable odor that filled the small space. When officers first tried the laundry room door, they found it locked, not with a deadbolt or chain, but with a simple interior lock, the kind meant more for privacy than security. This detail alone was odd. Who locks their laundry room from the outside? The door wasn't designed to be secured this way, yet someone had clearly gone to the trouble of ensuring it remained closed. Officers forced the door open, the lock giving way with relative ease, revealing the room's interior in full for the first time. And there, covering the floor, were freshly laid tiles, gleaming squares of ceramic that looked startlingly new compared to the rest of the house's worn, lived-in appearance. The tiles had been installed recently, expertly even, creating a clean, sealed surface where one presumably hadn't existed before. The smell of industrial sealant hung heavy in the air. That particular chemical odor that anyone who's done home renovation recognizes. The smell of adhesives and grout and finishing compounds curing in an enclosed space. This, the officers initially concluded, explained the mysterious odor that permeated the house. Jacob must have recently completed a home improvement project, perhaps upgrading his laundry room floor as part of general maintenance. The smell would dissipate in time as the chemicals fully cured and the space aired out. Beneath the new tiles, visible through gaps at the room's edges, lay the original concrete foundation floor. And running across that concrete, barely visible but present nonetheless, was a crack. Not a dramatic split or obvious structural damage. Just a thin line in the concrete that could have been caused by normal settling, by temperature changes, by the countless minor stresses that old foundations endure. The officers noted it in their report, but attributed no particular significance to it. Houses crack, foundations settle. This seemed entirely unremarkable. What the investigators couldn't know, what they had no way of knowing in those early days, was that they were standing directly above the answer they sought, separated from the truth by mere inches of tile and concrete and deliberate concealment. The investigation's focus quickly turned from the physical space to the human connections in Jacob's life. Who had access to his home? Who might have had motive to harm him? Who had last seen him alive? The circle of people close enough to Jacob to have answers was small, reflecting his quiet, contained social life. But within that small circle, two names quickly emerged as persons of interest. The first was Victor Hale, a name that hadn't appeared in any of the initial reports from family or friends, but that became immediately significant once investigators learned of his connection to Jacob. Victor had been Jacob's roommate, a temporary arrangement that Jacob's sister admitted she'd known little about beyond the bare facts. Jacob had mentioned renting out his spare bedroom a few months earlier to someone who needed a place while getting back on his feet financially. It had seemed like a practical arrangement for both parties. Jacob gained some additional income. Victor gained affordable housing in a decent neighborhood. But Victor was no longer living at the house when Jacob disappeared. According to the information investigators quickly gathered, Victor had moved out just 2 days before Jacob was reported missing, a timeline that immediately raised red flags. 2 days was an awfully convenient buffer, close enough to the disappearance to have potential relevance, far enough to establish an apparent alibi. When detectives tracked down Victor Hale at his new residence, a small apartment across town, they found a man in his early 30s who seemed cooperative but distinctly nervous during questioning. His hands fidgeted constantly as he spoke, his eyes darting around the interrogation room, his voice taking on that slightly higher pitch that often accompanies anxiety. Of course, nervous didn't necessarily mean guilty. Plenty of innocent people become anxious when questioned by police about a missing person. Victor's story was straightforward enough. He'd been renting the spare bedroom from Jacob for approximately 4 months, paying cash each month because, he claimed, neither of them had wanted to bother with formal lease agreements for such a temporary arrangement. Things had gone smoothly at first. Jacob was a decent landlord, kept to himself mostly, didn't complain about reasonable noise or the occasional friend visiting. They'd coexisted more than they'd interacted, which had suited both of them fine. But then, Victor explained, tensions had developed over bills. The arrangement had included utilities as part of the rent. But Victor claimed Jacob had accused him of running up the electric bill by leaving lights on and using too much hot water. The accusations had become more frequent and more pointed, according to Victor, until finally he decided it was easier to just move out than to continue dealing with the conflict. He'd given Jacob written notice, produced a handwritten note as proof, and had moved his belongings out over the course of a single day about a week ago. "I haven't seen Jacob since I moved out," Victor told investigators, his nervous energy filling the small room. "We didn't part on great terms, but I didn't wish him any harm. I just wanted to get my stuff and go." The timeline troubled investigators. Victor had moved out, by his own account, just days before Jacob's disappearance. Had there been a final confrontation? Had the disagreement over bills escalated into something more serious? Victor insisted there hadn't been any dramatic final interaction. He'd simply packed his things while Jacob was at work, left his key on the kitchen counter, and departed. Detectives administered a polygraph test, that controversial investigative tool that measures physiological responses to questions and purports to detect deception. Victor passed, showing no significant indicators of lying when asked directly if he'd harmed Jacob or knew what had happened to him. The polygraph, while not admissible in court and far from infallible, at least suggested Victor wasn't actively deceiving investigators about the core questions. The rental termination note Victor had produced seemed to support his story. A brief, handwritten message dated appropriately, signed by both Victor and Jacob, acknowledging the end of their arrangement. It looked legitimate on its face. The kind of informal document 2 men might draw up to avoid future disputes about security deposits or damage claims. What investigators didn't discover until much later, tragically, impossibly later, was that the signature on that note wasn't Jacob's at all. It was a forgery, practiced and executed by Victor himself, created to provide exactly the kind of paper trail that would deflect suspicion. But in those early weeks of the investigation, with limited resources and mounting pressure to develop leads, the note seemed to corroborate Victor's account. The focus began to shift. Peter Hollis had been cooperative from the very beginning. As Jacob's closest friend and neighbor, he'd been one of the first people investigators contacted, hoping he might have information about Jacob's final days. Peter had seemed genuinely distraught at his friend's disappearance, telling detectives everything he knew. Their bowling league nights, their casual weekend conversations, the comfortable rhythm of their friendship. But Peter had also mentioned something that would ultimately prove his undoing: an argument. About 3 weeks before Jacob disappeared, Peter and Jacob had gotten into a heated disagreement. Nothing physical, Peter emphasized. Just raised voices over something that seemed trivial in retrospect. Peter couldn't even remember exactly what had sparked it. Maybe something about borrowed tools that hadn't been returned promptly. Maybe a disagreement about splitting costs for pizza during a sports game they'd watched together. The kind of minor friction that occurs even in the best friendships, usually forgotten within days. Except neighbors had overheard it. Mrs. Henderson across the street had mentioned it to investigators, not accusingly, but simply as part of providing a complete picture of Jacob's final weeks. "I heard some shouting from Jacob's house one evening," she'd said. "I looked out and saw Peter leaving, and he seemed upset. But you know, friends argue sometimes. I didn't think much of it." But investigators did think much of it. Here was Peter Hollis, Jacob's closest friend, someone with frequent access to the house, someone who admittedly had argued with Jacob shortly before his disappearance. Peter's own account of his last interaction with Jacob began to sound suspicious under repeated questioning. He'd stopped by Jacob's house. When exactly? Why had he gone over? What had they discussed? Had there been any tension remaining from their earlier argument? Peter's answers remained consistent. But consistency can be interpreted as either truthfulness or well-rehearsed lies. He'd last seen Jacob about 4 days before the disappearance was reported, just a brief conversation in Jacob's driveway. No, there hadn't been any lingering tension from their previous argument. They'd cleared the air about that almost immediately afterward, the way adult friends do. Yes, he had a key to Jacob's house, but only for emergencies and to water plants when Jacob was away. No, he hadn't been inside the house recently. The problem was that Peter couldn't prove any of this. He lived alone, worked irregular hours, and had no alibi for the critical period when Jacob likely disappeared. His frequent visits to Jacob's house, a pattern born of genuine friendship and physical proximity, now looked potentially sinister. The argument, the access, the lack of an alibi. These elements combine to create a profile that investigation manuals call opportunity and motive. The media, having gotten wind of the missing persons case, began running stories about the mysterious disappearance of the quiet computer technician. And in those stories, carefully worded to avoid direct accusation but heavy with implication, Peter Hollis's name appeared with increasing frequency. Police are questioning a close friend of the missing man. Investigators have focused on someone with regular access to the victim's home. A neighbor reports an argument occurred weeks before the disappearance. On November 3, 1994, just over 2 weeks after Jacob was reported missing, Peter Hollis was detained for further questioning. Not arrested, not charged, but brought to the police station for what investigators called an extended interview. That interview stretched across 8 hours, with different detectives rotating through, each approaching from different angles, asking the same questions in different ways, looking for inconsistencies or cracks in Peter's story. Peter maintained his innocence throughout, growing increasingly exhausted and frustrated, but never wavering in his core account. He hadn't harmed Jacob. He didn't know where Jacob was. He wanted his friend found as much as anyone. But exhaustion and frustration can look a lot like guilt to investigators who've already decided on a theory of the case. By the time Peter was released, still not charged, but definitely marked as the primary suspect, the damage was done. His neighbors looked at him differently. His co-workers had seen the news reports. The whispers followed him everywhere. That's the guy they think killed his friend. That's the guy who's going to get away with murder. The court of public opinion had convicted Peter Hollis without a trial, without evidence, without any basis beyond proximity and an unlucky argument. Peter's life began to disintegrate under the weight of suspicion. Friends stopped calling. His bowling league asked him to take a temporary leave from the team. Someone spray-painted "murderer" across his garage door in the middle of the night. He started receiving threatening phone calls from vigilantes who decided he needed to confess or face their own brand of justice. And through it all, the actual evidence against Peter remained exactly what it had been from the beginning. Nothing. No physical evidence connected him to any crime. No witnesses placed him at Jacob's house during the relevant time frame. No forensic analysis linked him to anything suspicious. The entire case against Peter Hollis rested on opportunity, a minor argument, and investigative tunnel vision. Meanwhile, Victor Hale had faded into the background of the investigation. He'd passed his polygraph, provided his forged documentation, and moved on with his life while an innocent man twisted slowly in the wind of public suspicion. By the fall of 1995, just over a year after Jacob Pierce disappeared, the investigation had effectively stalled. Every lead had been exhausted. Every theory had been pursued to its dead end. The physical evidence from Jacob's house had been analyzed and reanalyzed, revealing nothing conclusive. Peter Hollis had been investigated so thoroughly that investigators knew more about his life than he probably knew himself. Yet no evidence of wrongdoing had materialized. The case went cold, relegated to that frustrating category of unsolved disappearances that haunt law enforcement agencies. The files that sit in boxes in evidence rooms, periodically reviewed but never advancing, waiting for that one piece of new information that might break everything open. Jacob Pierce remained missing. Peter Hollis remained under a cloud of suspicion. Victor Hale remained free. And beneath the freshly tiled floor of that laundry room, the truth waited in silent darkness, patient and terrible, for someone to finally see what had been hidden in plain sight all along. The years that followed Jacob Pierce's disappearance settled over Beaumont like dust accumulating on an old book, slowly, quietly, until the original details became obscured beneath layers of time and fading memory. By mid-1995, the local news outlets had moved on to fresher tragedies and more promising stories. The case that had once dominated headlines and coffee shop conversations became just another entry in the depressing catalog of unsolved disappearances, occasionally mentioned when journalists compiled retrospectives of the area's cold cases, but otherwise forgotten by everyone except those who'd loved Jacob. The media attention, which had been modest even at its peak, dwindled to nothing. Beaumont had never been a major media market, and a missing person case without a body, without dramatic evidence, without the kind of sensational details that capture national interest, simply couldn't sustain coverage indefinitely. There were only so many ways to write "still no leads" before editors and audiences alike lost interest. Within the local community, Jacob's name would occasionally surface in conversation, usually among those who'd known him personally or who remembered the investigation's impact on the neighborhood. Peter Hollis, still bearing the invisible scarlet letter of public suspicion despite never being charged, had eventually moved away from Maple Ridge Drive. Unable to continue living in a place where every sideways glance and whispered conversation reminded him of his destroyed reputation. The bowling alley where he and Jacob had spent so many Thursday evenings felt haunted now, and he never returned. Jacob's sister continued calling the Beaumont Police Department periodically, asking if there were any updates, any new leads, anything at all that might explain what had happened to her brother. The answer was always the same. No, nothing new, but we haven't given up. We'll contact you if anything develops. These reassurances, sincere at first, gradually became rote responses, the verbal equivalent of patting someone's hand sympathetically while knowing there's nothing more to be done. But if Jacob Pierce was slowly fading from public memory, his house remained. A physical structure that would change hands multiple times over the decades, each new owner unaware of the dark secret sealed beneath their feet. The property sat vacant for nearly 2 years after Jacob's disappearance was officially classified as a cold case. The house remained technically owned by Jacob, held in a kind of legal limbo while courts slowly processed the paperwork necessary to handle the estate of someone missing but not declared dead. His sister, as next of kin, eventually gained control of the property and made the painful decision to sell it. She couldn't afford to maintain an empty house hundreds of miles away. And besides, stepping into that space where her brother had vanished felt impossibly difficult. The first new owners were a young couple, the Robinsons, who'd been drawn to the neighborhood by its affordability and quiet suburban character. The real estate agent had disclosed Jacob's disappearance, legally required information in Texas property transactions, but had framed it in the most neutral terms possible. The previous owner unfortunately went missing some years ago, but there's been no indication of any problems with the property itself. The Robinsons moved in with the optimism of first-time homeowners, excited to start their lives together in this modest, single-story house. They repainted the walls in brighter colors, replaced some of the older fixtures, and settled into the rhythms of suburban life. Everything seemed fine at first, but within months, they began noticing something odd. A smell in the laundry area. Not constant and not overwhelming, but definitely present, especially during humid summer months when the air hung heavy and still. It was unpleasant, but difficult to describe precisely. Not sewage, not decay exactly, just wrong. Something organic and disturbing that seemed to emanate from the floor itself. They called a plumber, thinking perhaps there was a leak or backup in the pipes somewhere beneath the house. The plumber crawled through the accessible plumbing, found nothing obviously wrong, and suggested that old houses sometimes develop odd smells from accumulated buildup in drain lines or from moisture issues in the foundation. He recommended enzymatic drain cleaners and better ventilation. The Robinsons followed his advice, and the smell would seem to diminish for a while before gradually returning. After 3 years, the Robinsons sold the house, not explicitly because of the laundry room smell, they told their agent, but it certainly hadn't helped. They were relocating for work anyway, they explained, though friends would later say the couple had seemed genuinely unsettled by something about the house, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what. The next owners, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Simmons, lived there for nearly a decade. She too noticed the smell, but being of a practical generation that had weathered far worse than mysterious odors, simply kept the laundry room door closed most of the time and ran a dehumidifier constantly. Old houses have quirks, she'd tell her adult children when they visited and wrinkled their noses. You learn to live with them. By this point, the early 2000s had arrived, and Jacob Pierce's disappearance had receded even further into the past. The case file sat in a storage room at the Beaumont Police Department, occasionally pulled out when a new detective felt motivated to review old cold cases. But the passage of time had only made the mystery more impenetrable, not less. Witnesses' memories had faded. Physical evidence had been returned or destroyed according to standard retention policies. The trail, already cold in 1995, had frozen solid. The house changed hands twice more. Once to a family who stayed only 18 months before divorcing and selling in the settlement. Once to a young professional who used it primarily as a place to sleep between long work hours and business trips. Each occupant noticed the smell to varying degrees. Each attributed it to mundane causes: old pipes, foundation moisture, inadequate ventilation, the mysterious quirks that all houses accumulate over decades of existence. None of them knew they were living above a tomb. While the house on Maple Ridge Drive cycled through owners, Victor Hale was conducting his own kind of cycle. A carefully orchestrated pattern of movement and reinvention designed to ensure he remained unnoticed, unremarkable, and most importantly, unconnected to the events of October 1994. Victor understood something that many criminals fail to grasp. In modern America, true invisibility isn't about hiding in shadows or living off the grid entirely. It's about being so aggressively normal, so perfectly unmemorable, that you blend into the background noise of ordinary life. It's about being the neighbor people forget they have, the coworker whose name no one can quite remember after they've left, the tenant who pays rent on time and never causes problems worth documenting. He moved frequently, but not frantically. Every 2 to 3 years, usually, citing employment opportunities or family obligations or simply a desire for a change of scenery. Nothing about his movement pattern screamed fugitive. People move for work all the time, especially those in trades and manual labor. His relocations took him back and forth between Texas and Louisiana, sometimes to small towns, sometimes to larger cities, always to places where a handyman with decent skills could find work without too many questions. The name variations were subtle but effective. Sometimes he was Victor Hale, sometimes Vic Hale, occasionally V. Halden or Victor Holden, changes small enough to seem like personal preference, or informal nicknames rather than deliberate deception. He never obtained false identification or committed the kind of identity fraud that might trigger background checks or legal scrutiny. He simply used slightly different versions of his name on job applications and rental agreements, exploiting the fact that record-keeping systems, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, weren't sophisticated enough to automatically flag these minor variations. His work history read like a catalog of forgettable employment. Apartment maintenance worker, general handyman for a property management company, seasonal worker at a hardware store, assistant to an independent contractor, janitor at a small office complex. These were jobs that paid cash or check, that didn't require extensive background investigations, that valued competence over credentials. Victor was competent. His skills with tools and basic construction were genuine, honed over years of work and necessity. He showed up on time, did what he was asked, and never drew attention to himself. He avoided social media entirely, claiming, on the rare occasions anyone asked, that he just wasn't interested in all that technology, that he preferred to keep his private life private. This was mildly unusual by the 2010s, when Facebook and other platforms had achieved near universal adoption, but not so strange as to raise suspicions. Plenty of older blue-collar workers maintained similar attitudes, viewing social media as a waste of time or an invasion of privacy. He conducted his financial life almost entirely in cash, maintaining only a basic checking account for depositing paychecks and paying rent. No credit cards, no loans, no mortgages, nothing that would create a detailed financial trail or require credit checks that might reveal inconsistencies in his background. He lived frugally, not out of poverty, but out of a deliberate choice to minimize his footprint in the systems that track and categorize modern lives. neighbors across the decades and locations would later struggle to remember much about him at all. Polite, they'd say, searching for details. Quiet. The kind of guy who'd nod hello when you saw him but never stop to chat. Some would remember he had a pickup truck, or was it a van? The color varied in their memories. Blue, maybe gray, possibly white. Had he ever mentioned family? A few thought maybe he'd said something about a sister once, or perhaps it was a brother. No one was certain. This aggressive normality, this cultivation of forgettable ordinariness, was Victor's greatest achievement and his most effective protection. He existed in that social blind spot that people maintain for individuals who are present but not interesting, visible but not memorable, real but somehow not quite substantial enough to leave a lasting impression. He worked his handyman jobs, completed his tasks competently, collected his pay, and moved on. Landlords would have struggled to say anything negative about him as a tenant. He paid on time, kept the place clean, never caused disturbances. He was the ideal renter in every measurable way, which meant he never gave anyone a reason to look more closely at his background or question his origins. The years accumulated: 1995, 2000, 2005, 2010. The turn of the millennium came and went. Technology advanced from dial-up internet to smartphones, from VHS tapes to streaming services. The world changed dramatically around Victor Hale, while he remained essentially frozen, locked in the same pattern of movement and reinvention, carrying his terrible secret like an invisible weight that never quite showed on his shoulders. By 2015, Jacob Pierce had been missing for more than 20 years. An entire generation had grown up in Beaumont with no memory of the case at all. The house on Maple Ridge Drive, now owned by its fifth or sixth family since Jacob's disappearance, was just another suburban home among thousands. Remarkable only for that persistent, unexplained smell in the laundry room that occupants learned to tolerate or ignore. Victor, now in his 50s, continued his quiet migration between cities and states, working his forgettable jobs, maintaining his invisible profile. He'd succeeded in remaining unnoticed for nearly 3 decades, an almost unthinkable achievement in an age of increasing surveillance and interconnected databases. He'd managed to hide not by running, but by blending, not by escaping, but by becoming so thoroughly unremarkable that no one thought to look at him twice. The cold case file on Jacob Pierce's disappearance gathered dust in police storage. The media had long since forgotten the story. Even among those who'd known Jacob personally, memories had faded and distorted with time, the way all memories eventually do. Life had moved on, as it always does, leaving the mystery of Jacob Pierce's fate suspended in that terrible state of unresolved uncertainty. And beneath the tiles in that laundry room, beneath the concrete foundation, the truth remained patient and still, waiting for someone to finally see what had been hidden for so long, waiting for the moment when Victor Hale's carefully constructed invisibility would finally crack, and the past would come flooding back into the present with devastating force. That moment was coming, though no one knew it yet. The clock was ticking toward 2021, toward a renovation project that would change everything, toward the day when a contractor's sledgehammer would break through more than just old tile and concrete, shattering the silence that had protected Victor Hale for 27 years. 27 years is a long time to keep a secret. Long enough for technology to transform, for children to grow into adults, for entire neighborhoods to change character. Long enough, Victor Hale must have believed, for the past to stay buried forever. But concrete, no matter how carefully poured, cannot hold back truth indefinitely. The spring of 2022 brought unseasonably warm weather to Beaumont. the kind of early heat that makes homeowners think about long-delayed renovation projects. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had new owners again. The Castellanos, a family of 4 who'd purchased the property the previous fall. Like every owner before them, they'd noticed that persistent, inexplicable smell in the laundry area. Unlike their predecessors, they'd decided to do something definitive about it. "We're tearing everything out," Maria Castellano told the contractor she'd hired, a local renovation specialist named Dave Chen, who'd been in business for over 15 years. "New plumbing, new flooring, new everything. I don't care what it costs. I want that smell gone." Chen and his crew arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, their trucks loaded with the tools of demolition and reconstruction. The plan was straightforward. Remove the old tile flooring, assess the plumbing situation, and install modern fixtures that would finally solve whatever drainage or moisture issue had plagued this room for decades. It was the kind of job Chen had done hundreds of times. Routine, predictable, unremarkable. The tile came up easily enough, revealing the concrete foundation beneath. Chen's initial assessment suggested they'd need to break through a section of the concrete to access the old plumbing and install the new lines the Castellanos wanted. He marked out the area with chalk, positioned his crew, and picked up the sledgehammer that would begin the process of opening up the floor. The first blow cracked the concrete. The second widened the crack. The third broke through entirely, and immediately, the smell that had haunted this room for nearly 3 decades intensified dramatically. No longer masked by sealant and tile, but rising directly from the cavity beneath. Chen stopped mid-swing, his experienced nose recognizing something that went beyond old pipes or foundation moisture. "Hold up," he told his crew, setting down the sledgehammer. He knelt beside the broken section of concrete, shining his work light into the dark space below. What the light revealed would transform a routine renovation into a crime scene. And finally, after 27 years of silence, give Jacob Pierce's family the terrible closure they'd never stopped seeking. The cavity beneath the concrete was deliberately constructed, not a natural gap in the foundation, but an intentionally created space, sealed and hidden. And within that space, wrapped in the deteriorated remains of what had once been a heavy tarp, lay skeletal remains that were unmistakably human. Chen immediately ordered his crew out of the room, told them not to touch anything else, and called 911. Within 30 minutes, the house on Maple Ridge Drive was swarming with police vehicles, crime scene technicians, and investigators who'd been summoned to what had suddenly become one of the most significant discoveries in Beaumont's criminal history. The Castellanos, shocked and horrified, stood in their driveway while strangers in protective gear documented every inch of their laundry room. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks and porches, phones out, capturing images and video of the sudden law enforcement presence. Local news vans arrived by early afternoon, their reporters breathlessly updating viewers about the grim discovery at a quiet suburban home. And in the Jefferson County Cold Case Unit, a file that had sat dormant for over 2 decades was suddenly, urgently, pulled from storage. The excavation and documentation process took days. Forensic anthropologists worked with painstaking care to remove the remains from their concrete tomb, photographing every layer, collecting every piece of evidence, ensuring that nothing was lost or contaminated in the process of bringing this buried secret back into the light. The remains told a story that forensic experts could read like text. The skeleton was complete, positioned in what investigators recognized as a deliberately compact arrangement. The body had been placed into the cavity carefully, probably wrapped tightly in the tarp to minimize space. The position wasn't natural. This wasn't someone who'd fallen or collapsed, but someone who'd been positioned, handled, concealed with intention and planning. The tarp itself, though deteriorated after nearly 3 decades underground, retained enough integrity for forensic analysis. It was industrial grade, the kind available at any hardware store but more commonly used by contractors and handymen than casual homeowners. Fragments of the material were carefully preserved for later DNA analysis. Surrounding the remains were layers of quick-dry cement, multiple pores, investigators noted, suggesting the cavity had been filled gradually, probably to ensure complete sealing and to avoid the kind of obvious irregularities that a single massive pore might create. Chemical analysis of the cement would later confirm it was consistent with industrial products available in the mid-1990s, brands that a handyman or someone familiar with construction work would know how to use effectively. But it was the skull that provided the most crucial and disturbing evidence. Even to the untrained eye, the damage was obvious. A depressed fracture on the left side, the kind of injury that forensic pathologists immediately recognize as blunt force trauma. This wasn't an accident, wasn't a fall, wasn't anything that could be explained away as natural causes or misadventure. Someone had struck this person with significant force, hard enough to fracture bone, hard enough to kill. Identification of remains that have been buried for nearly 3 decades presents significant challenges. But modern forensic science has tools that didn't exist when Jacob Pierce first disappeared. Dental records, fortunately, had been preserved in the original case file. Jacob's dentist had provided them in 1994 in case they became necessary. The forensic odontologist's comparison took only hours. The dental patterns matched perfectly. The remains were almost certainly Jacob Pierce. But almost certainly isn't sufficient for legal purposes. The investigation needed absolute confirmation, which meant turning to DNA analysis. Jacob's sister, now in her 60s and still living out of state, received a phone call that she'd waited 27 years to receive, and dreaded every day of that wait. The remains might be her brother. Would she be willing to provide a DNA sample for comparison? She was on a plane to Texas the next day. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, which traces maternal lineage and can provide identification even from degraded samples, confirmed what the dental records had suggested. The remains discovered beneath the laundry room floor were definitively, without question, Jacob Michael Pierce, after 27 years of uncertainty, of hoping against hope that maybe Jacob had simply walked away and started a new life somewhere, of imagining scenarios where he might still be alive. His sister finally had her answer, and it was the worst answer possible. Jacob had never left his house. He'd been there all along, sealed beneath the floor, while life continued above him, while owners complained about strange smells, while investigators pursued false leads, while Peter Hollis's reputation was destroyed over a suspicion that should have landed on someone else entirely. The forensic findings painted a grim picture of Jacob's final moments. The blunt force trauma to his skull had been the cause of death, a violent blow that had likely killed him quickly. Though whether it had been instantaneous or whether Jacob had suffered remained impossible to determine after so much time. The personal items found with his remains included fragments of fabric that, when compared to photographs from the original investigation, matched the work clothes Jacob had been known to wear, a detail that suggested he'd been killed either early in the morning or after returning from work, times when he would have been wearing his technician's uniform. The layers of quick-dry cement told their own story of deliberate concealment. Someone had known exactly how to seal a body beneath a concrete floor in a way that would prevent detection, minimize odor, though not eliminate it entirely, and create a surface that could be tiled over to appear completely normal. This wasn't amateur work done in a panic. This was methodical, planned, executed with a level of knowledge that suggested familiarity with construction and renovation techniques. As forensic analysis continued on the remains and the physical evidence from the burial site, the Jefferson County Cold Case Unit activated a full-scale investigation with resources and technology that hadn't been available in 1994. The original case file was digitized in its entirety, every witness statement re-examined, every piece of evidence reassessed through the lens of modern forensic capabilities. And critically, evidence that had been collected from Jacob's house in 1994, but never fully analyzed due to the technological limitations of the time. Trace evidence, fingerprints, DNA samples, was now subjected to analysis using techniques that seemed almost miraculous compared to what had been possible nearly 3 decades earlier. The breakthrough came from the tarp. Despite its deterioration, despite nearly 3 decades of exposure to moisture and chemicals in the concrete, the material had preserved biological evidence. DNA extraction, using cutting-edge techniques that could work with degraded samples, yielded a profile. When that profile was run through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that serves as the FBI's national DNA database, it generated a match. Victor Hale, arrested in 1992 for a minor assault charge that had been pleaded down to disturbing the peace. The arrest had required a DNA sample under Texas law, a sample that had sat in a database for 30 years, waiting for exactly this moment. The investigators felt that electric surge of recognition that comes when a cold case suddenly breaks open. Victor Hale, the roommate who'd moved out just days before Jacob disappeared. The man who'd been questioned briefly in 1994, who'd passed a polygraph, who'd provided documentation of his rental termination, and who'd then faded into the background while suspicion fell on Peter Hollis instead. Further analysis of the original physical evidence yielded another critical discovery. In 1994, investigators had collected fingerprints from throughout Jacob's house, including from the laundry room. One print lifted from the underside of the washing machine, an odd location that had seemed insignificant at the time, had never been matched because it hadn't belonged to Jacob or to any of the people investigators had initially suspected. That print had sat in the evidence file for 27 years, waiting for the right comparison. When forensic technicians compared that print to Victor Hale's employment record from 1992, which included fingerprints for a background check, they found their match. Victor had touched the underside of that washing machine, in a location that suggested he'd been moving it, manipulating it, doing exactly what someone would do if they were preparing to break through the floor beneath it and needed the appliance out of the way. The DNA and fingerprint evidence pointed in one direction. Victor Hale had been in that laundry room, had handled that tarp, had been present during the concealment of Jacob Pierce's body. Now investigators just needed to find him. The manhunt for Victor Hale began with the recognition that nearly 30 years had passed, that Victor might have changed his appearance, his location, even his identity. But modern investigative techniques, database searches, social media analysis, financial tracking systems that hadn't existed in 1994, made finding someone vastly more difficult than it had once been, even for someone as deliberately low profile as Victor had tried to remain. Investigators traced his movements through tax records, employment histories, rental agreements, and the digital breadcrumbs that even the most careful person leaves in the modern world. The pattern they uncovered matched exactly what one would expect from someone trying to stay hidden. Frequent moves, name variations, cash-based lifestyle, minimal online presence. But each data point, each small piece of information, helped narrow the search. By late April 2022, investigators had located their target. Victor Hale, now 62 years old, living in Lafayette, Louisiana, under the name Vic Halden, working as a janitor for a small office complex. He lived alone in a modest apartment, drove an older pickup truck, and maintained the same aggressively unremarkable profile he'd cultivated for 3 decades. On April 28, 2022, a joint task force of Jefferson County investigators and Louisiana law enforcement officers knocked on the door of Victor's apartment. When he answered, wearing worn work clothes and looking confused by the sudden law enforcement presence, they identified themselves and informed him he was under arrest for the murder of Jacob Pierce. Victor's first response was denial. Complete, emphatic denial. He didn't know what they were talking about. Jacob Pierce? Yes, he'd known Jacob, had rented a room from him briefly decades ago. But he hadn't seen Jacob since moving out. This was a mistake, obviously a terrible mistake. He needed to call a lawyer. But when investigators told him about the DNA evidence, the fingerprint, the body discovered beneath the laundry room floor, something shifted in Victor's demeanor. The emphatic denials became quieter, more measured. He stopped insisting on a lawyer and instead began constructing a different narrative, one that he must have hoped might mitigate his legal exposure. Jacob had died of natural causes, Victor claimed. Maybe a heart attack or a stroke. Victor had come home from work one evening and found Jacob collapsed in the laundry room, already dead. He'd panicked, Victor said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. He'd panicked because he'd been living there without proper documentation, because he'd had that prior arrest record, because he knew how it would look. So instead of calling 911, instead of doing the right thing, he'd made a terrible decision born of fear and confusion. He'd buried Jacob beneath the laundry room floor, Victor admitted, and he'd forged the rental termination note to cover his tracks. But he hadn't killed anyone. Jacob had died naturally, and Victor had simply panicked, made everything worse, by trying to hide the body rather than report it properly. It was a carefully constructed story, designed to explain the physical evidence while avoiding a murder charge. And it might have been believable if not for the forensic evidence that directly contradicted it. Investigators presented Victor with the pathology reports showing the blunt force trauma to Jacob's skull. They explained that medical examiners could distinguish between injuries that occur before death and damage that happens afterward, and that Jacob's skull fracture was definitively ante-mortem. It had occurred while Jacob was alive, had in fact been the cause of his death. They showed him the analysis of the concrete work, the deliberate construction of the burial site, the methodical covering up that spoke to planning and intention rather than panic. Faced with evidence that demolished his natural causes story, Victor's resistance finally crumbled. Over the course of a lengthy interrogation, conducted with his court-appointed attorney present, Victor Hale confessed to the murder of Jacob Pierce. The argument, Victor explained, had been about money, specifically about unpaid rent and Jacob's threat to evict him. Victor had been struggling financially, had fallen behind on payments, and Jacob had finally lost patience with the excuses and delays. On that October evening in 1994, Jacob had confronted Victor, demanding payment or immediate departure. The confrontation had escalated, voices rising, until Jacob had told Victor he had 24 hours to get out, or Jacob would call the police and have him forcibly removed. Victor had seen his living situation collapsing, had felt trapped and desperate, and in a moment of rage had grabbed something heavy. He couldn't remember exactly what, maybe a wrench from his tool bag, and struck Jacob. Once. Hard enough to drop him where he stood. Victor claimed he hadn't meant to kill Jacob, had only wanted to shut him up, to stop the threats and the pressure. But Jacob had fallen. had hit the laundry room floor with that terrible finality that leaves no doubt about the seriousness of what's just happened. And Victor, looking at his landlord's body, had made a series of decisions that would define the rest of his life. He'd worked through that night and into the early morning, moving Jacob's body into the cavity beneath the laundry room floor that he'd spent the previous week preparing. This detail would later chill investigators. The premeditation it implied, the possibility that Victor had been planning this for days before the actual killing. He'd sealed the cavity with quick, dry cement, working in stages to avoid creating obvious irregularities. He'd cleaned the laundry room meticulously, removing any obvious evidence of violence. He'd forged the rental termination note, practiced Jacob's signature until it looked convincing enough to pass casual inspection. And then he'd simply left, moving out exactly as he'd claimed to investigators in 1994, betting that no one would look too closely at the new floor tiles in the laundry room. It had been, Victor admitted with something almost like pride, a perfect plan. It had worked for 27 years, longer than many marriages, longer than most careers. He'd lived an entire adult life on the other side of that October night, had worked and moved and existed, carrying his secret like a stone in his pocket, heavy but manageable, as long as he never let anyone look too closely. But concrete eventually cracks, renovations eventually happen, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its way back to light. Victor Hale was formally charged with first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and multiple counts of fraud related to the forged documents. His confession, combined with the physical evidence, the DNA analysis, and the forensic findings, built a case that prosecutors knew was virtually unassailable. After 27 years, Jacob Pierce's murder would finally face justice in a courtroom. And Peter Hollis, the innocent friend whose life had been destroyed by wrongful suspicion, would finally be vindicated by the same truth that condemned Victor Hale. The wait had been agonizingly long. But the truth, once unearthed, proved impossible to deny. The confession of Victor Hale sent shockwaves through Beaumont that extended far beyond the immediate horror of Jacob Pierce's murder. As news outlets picked up the story, this time with national attention that the original 1994 disappearance had never received, one name kept surfacing alongside Victor's. Peter Hollis, the innocent friend whose life had been systematically dismantled by wrongful suspicion. Peter had left Beaumont in 1996, unable to continue living in a community where half the population believed he'd murdered his best friend and gotten away with it. He'd moved to a small town in Oklahoma, taken a job well beneath his qualifications because his reputation had preceded him. Potential employers would search his name, find the old news articles, and suddenly positions would be filled or no longer available. He'd never married, never had children, never built the kind of stable adult life that his methodical, reliable personality should have naturally created. The years between 1994 and 2022 had been a kind of slow-motion destruction for Peter. He'd lost his job at the manufacturing plant where he'd worked for over a decade. Not fired outright, which would have been legally actionable, but encouraged to resign through a campaign of subtle hostility and isolation that made his position untenable. His co-workers had stopped inviting him to lunch. His supervisor had begun finding fault with work that had previously been praised. The unspoken message was clear. We don't want a suspected murderer working here. His social life had evaporated almost overnight. Friends who'd known him for years suddenly became unavailable, their phone calls unreturned, their invitations mysteriously lost. The bowling league that had been the center of his social world, the place where he and Jacob had spent countless Thursday evenings, had asked him to leave. citing concerns from other members about his continued participation. Even casual acquaintances would cross the street to avoid encountering him, their discomfort palpable and humiliating. The financial burden had been crushing. Though never formally charged, Peter had still needed to hire an attorney to protect his interests during the investigation, draining his modest savings. The stress had manifested in health problems, high blood pressure, anxiety, insomnia, that required ongoing medical treatment he could barely afford. He'd been forced to sell his home on Maple Ridge Drive at a loss, the property tainted by its association with the case, and had moved into progressively smaller, cheaper apartments as his economic situation deteriorated. But perhaps worst of all was the psychological toll. Peter had lived for 27 years, knowing he was innocent, but unable to prove it. Watching helplessly as his reputation, his livelihood, and his future dissolved under the weight of public suspicion. He'd experienced the particular hell of being condemned without trial, judged without evidence, sentenced to a lifetime of social exile for a crime he hadn't committed. When investigators finally contacted Peter in April 2022 to inform him that Jacob's body had been found and that Victor Hale had been arrested, Peter's first response was silence. A long, profound silence that the detective on the phone later described as the sound of 27 years of burden finally lifting. When Peter finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotions he'd spent nearly 3 decades suppressing. Relief, vindication, grief, and a bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying innocence like a weight no one else could see. Peter agreed to speak to reporters, his first real public statement since the dark days of 1994 and 1995. He appeared at a press conference looking older than his years, his face lined with the stress of decades lived under suspicion. When he spoke, his voice carried both the relief of vindication and the irreparable sadness of understanding how much had been stolen from him. "I knew Jake better than anyone," Peter said, his hands gripping the podium as if steadying himself against the weight of memory. "We were best friends. We bowled together every Thursday, talked about everything and nothing. Helped each other with yard work and home repairs. He was one of the good ones, you know. Reliable, honest, kind. And I spent 27 years being accused of killing him, while the real killer..." His voice broke, and he paused to compose himself. "While the real killer was someone we'd both trusted. Someone Jake had welcomed into his home. Someone I probably shook hands with, talked to, never knowing I was standing next to the person who'd murdered my best friend and let me take the blame for it." The pain in Peter's voice was evident. But so was something else. A grim understanding that while Victor's arrest vindicated him legally, it couldn't restore what had been taken. "I lost my job, my home, my reputation, 27 years of my life," Peter continued. "I lost the chance to marry, to have a family, to build a career. I lost all of that because investigators decided I must be guilty, and the real killer was smart enough to point them in the wrong direction. No arrest, no confession, no amount of apologies can give me back those years." The community reaction to Victor's confession was a complex mixture of shock, anger, and introspection. Neighbors who'd lived near Victor over the years, in various Texas and Louisiana locations, expressed disbelief that this quiet, polite man had been harboring such a dark secret. "He seemed so normal," was the refrain heard repeatedly, a testament to Victor's decades-long performance of ordinariness. But beneath the shock was growing anger directed at the initial investigation. How had Victor managed to deflect suspicion so easily in 1994? Why had investigators fixated on Peter Hollis despite the lack of physical evidence? What about the forged rental termination note that should have been examined more carefully? The questions accumulated, each pointing toward investigative failures that had allowed a guilty man to walk free, while an innocent friend suffered. Local advocacy groups seized on the case as an example of the dangers of tunnel vision in criminal investigations. The tendency of law enforcement to focus on a single suspect and interpret all evidence through the lens of that person's guilt, while overlooking or dismissing alternative explanations. Peter Hollis had become a suspect primarily because of proximity and an unfortunate argument. And once investigators had decided he was their man, confirmation bias had shaped every subsequent decision. The Beaumont Police Department and Jefferson County Sheriff's Office faced intense public scrutiny. Critics pointed out that Victor Hale had been right there in 1994. A recent roommate with access to the house, someone who'd moved out days before the disappearance. Someone with construction skills who would have known how to seal a body beneath concrete. Yet he'd been interviewed briefly, given a polygraph that he'd either genuinely passed or managed to manipulate, and then essentially dismissed while investigators pursued Peter instead. The forged rental termination note became a particular point of controversy. Handwriting analysis in 1994 had apparently accepted the document as legitimate, despite it being the only piece of evidence that Jacob had willingly agreed to Victor's departure. Why hadn't investigators been more skeptical? Why hadn't they brought in additional experts? Why had they taken Victor's word over the suspicions of Jacob's family and friends? Some of the anger also fell on the polygraph test, that controversial investigative tool that continues to be used despite significant questions about its reliability. Victor had passed his 1994 polygraph, which had helped deflect suspicion away from him. But polygraphs measure physiological responses to stress, and someone who is either genuinely unemotional about their crime or who has convinced themselves of a false narrative can sometimes produce results that appear truthful. The case became another data point in the ongoing debate about whether polygraphs should continue to be used in criminal investigations at all. As public pressure mounted, the Jefferson County Cold Case Unit and the Beaumont Police Department conducted an internal review of the 1994 investigation, examining what had gone wrong and what lessons could be learned. The resulting report, released in July 2022, was a sobering document that acknowledged multiple failures, while also noting the technological limitations of the era. The report admitted that investigators had developed tunnel vision around Peter Hollis, allowing their suspicion of him to overshadow other potential leads. It acknowledged that the forged rental termination note should have been subjected to more rigorous analysis. It noted that Victor Hale's convenient departure timeline should have raised more red flags than it apparently had. And it concluded that the investigation had been hampered by both technological limitations. DNA analysis in 1994 was nowhere near as sophisticated as it would become, and by cognitive biases that had led investigators to see what they expected to see rather than following the evidence objectively. The report stopped short of assigning individual blame to specific officers, most of whom had since retired or passed away. But it represented an institutional acknowledgement of failure that advocacy groups and community members had been demanding. On August 15, 2022, in a ceremony that was simultaneously vindicating and heartbreaking, local authorities issued a formal public apology to Peter Hollis. The current police chief, who hadn't been with the department in 1994, stood at a podium alongside the county sheriff and read a statement that had been carefully crafted by department lawyers, but that nonetheless carried genuine remorse. The Beaumont Police Department and Jefferson County Sheriff's Office offer our sincere and unreserved apology to Mr. Peter Hollis for the investigation failures that resulted in his wrongful identification as a person of interest in the 1994 disappearance of Jacob Pierce. The chief read, his voice steady but his expression grave. Mr. Hollis lost his reputation, his livelihood, and nearly 3 decades of his life due to investigative errors and tunnel vision that should never have occurred. While we cannot restore what was taken from him, we can acknowledge that he was gravely wronged by the very institutions that should have protected him and sought true justice for his friend. Peter attended the ceremony but did not speak. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, as officials apologized for destroying his life. When reporters approached him afterward, he offered only a brief statement. "I accept their apology for what it's worth. But an apology doesn't give me back my life. It doesn't bring Jake back. It just is what it is." The legal proceedings against Victor Hale moved with surprising speed once his confession was secured. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence, the DNA, the fingerprints, the forensic analysis of Jacob's remains, and his own detailed confession, Victor's court-appointed attorney advised him that fighting the charges would be futile and would likely result in a capital murder conviction that could bring the death penalty. In Texas, capital murder charges can be pursued when murder is committed during certain circumstances, including murder committed during the course of another felony. Victor's burial and concealment of Jacob's body, combined with the apparent premeditation suggested by the prepared cavity beneath the laundry room floor, could potentially support such charges. The prospect of lethal injection, Texas's method of execution, motivated Victor's legal team to negotiate a plea agreement. In March 2023, nearly a year after his arrest and 29 years after Jacob Pierce's murder, Victor Hale stood in a Jefferson County courtroom and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and concealment of a body. The plea agreement, approved by the district attorney in consultation with Jacob's surviving family, removed the death penalty from consideration in exchange for Victor's guilty plea and a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Jacob's sister attended the sentencing hearing, her first time seeing Victor Hale in person. She'd submitted a victim impact statement that was read aloud by the prosecutor, her words carrying nearly 3 decades of grief, anger, and loss. "Victor Hale didn't just kill my brother," the statement read. "He stole Jacob from everyone who loved him. He stole 27 years of answers, 27 years of closure, 27 years of being able to properly grieve and move forward. He destroyed Peter Hollis's life to save his own skin. He walked around free, working jobs, living his life, while my brother lay buried beneath a floor, and we all wondered what had happened to him. There is no punishment severe enough for what he's done, no sentence long enough to balance the scales. But knowing he'll spend the rest of his life in prison, knowing he'll never again walk free while my brother remains in the ground, provides some measure of justice." Victor, given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, offered a brief statement that struck many observers as inadequate given the magnitude of his crimes. "I'm sorry for what I did," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I panicked, and I made terrible choices. And I know I can't ever make it right. I'm sorry to Jacob's family, and I'm sorry to Peter Hollis for what happened to him. I know it doesn't mean much, but I am sorry." The judge, visibly unmoved by Victor's apology, imposed the agreed-upon sentence: life imprisonment without parole on the murder charge, plus an additional 20 years for concealment of a body. The sentences to run consecutively. At 63 years old, Victor Hale would spend the remainder of his life behind bars, dying in prison decades from now. His carefully constructed invisibility replaced by the ultimate visibility of incarceration. As Victor was led from the courtroom in shackles, Jacob's sister watched him go, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and profound sadness. Justice had finally been served. but it had come far too late to heal all the wounds his crime had opened. The case's resolution sparked broader conversations about the evolution of forensic science and its implications for cold case investigations. The Jacob Pierce case became a textbook example of how technological advances can solve cases that seemed unsolvable with the tools available at the time of the original investigation. In 1994, DNA analysis existed, but was far more limited in its applications than it would become. The techniques that eventually identified Victor Hale from degraded DNA on a decades-old tarp simply weren't available to investigators at the time. Similarly, fingerprint databases and matching systems have become exponentially more sophisticated, allowing prints that went unmatched in the 1990s to be identified decades later. Law enforcement agencies across the country took notice. The case prompted many jurisdictions to revisit their own cold case files, particularly those from the 1980s and 1990s, with an eye toward applying modern forensic techniques to old evidence. In Texas alone, the Pierce case motivated the re-examination of over 300 unsolved murders and disappearances, leading to several additional cold case breakthroughs in the years that followed. The case also became a centerpiece in discussions about wrongful accusations and the importance of thorough, unbiased investigations. Peter Hollis's experience, subjected to intense scrutiny and public condemnation despite a complete absence of physical evidence, illustrated the dangers of investigative tunnel vision and the devastating consequences that can follow when law enforcement focuses on the wrong suspect. Several law enforcement training programs began using the Pierce case as a teaching tool, highlighting both the forensic breakthroughs that eventually solved it and the investigative failures that had allowed a guilty man to remain free while an innocent friend suffered. The case study emphasizes the importance of following physical evidence over circumstantial suspicions, the need for rigorous verification of documentation, and the dangers of allowing confirmation bias to shape an investigation. For Peter Hollis, Victor's conviction provided legal vindication but couldn't restore what had been lost. Now in his 60s, Peter had spent more than half his life under the shadow of wrongful suspicion. The formal apology from law enforcement, while appreciated, couldn't give him back his career, his reputation, or the family he'd never had, because potential partners had been scared away by his tainted name. Peter filed a civil lawsuit against Jefferson County and the city of Beaumont, seeking compensation for the damages he'd suffered due to the wrongful accusation and negligent investigation. The case was settled out of court in late 2023 for an undisclosed sum that sources close to the proceedings described as substantial but inadequate given the scope of damages. The money, Peter told friends, provided some security for his remaining years, but couldn't purchase the one thing he truly wanted, the life he should have lived. Jacob's sister, finally able to properly lay her brother to rest after 29 years, held a memorial service in Beaumont in the summer of 2023. Friends and former co-workers who'd never stopped wondering what had happened to the quiet, methodical computer technician gathered to remember him and to mourn what had been stolen. Peter Hollis attended, standing quietly at the back of the room, honoring the friend he'd never stopped believing in and never stopped missing. The house on Maple Ridge Drive, its dark secret finally revealed, sold in late 2023 to new owners who were fully informed of its history. The laundry room where Jacob Pierce had been murdered and buried was completely renovated. The floor replaced, the space transformed. But the Castellanos, the family who'd commissioned the renovation that uncovered the truth, had already moved out, unable to continue living in a house that had become synonymous with murder. In the end, the case of Jacob Pierce stands as a testament to both the power and the limitations of justice. Modern forensic science eventually revealed the truth that had been hidden for nearly 3 decades, bringing a measure of closure to a grieving family and vindication to a wrongly accused friend. But that truth came too late to prevent the destruction of Peter Hollis's life. Too late to spare Jacob's family 3 decades of uncertainty and pain. Too late to catch Victor Hale before he'd lived an entire adult life free, while his victim lay sealed beneath concrete. Justice was served. But it was justice profoundly delayed. And in that delay, countless additional victims were created. Not just the man buried beneath a floor, but the friend whose life was ruined by suspicion, the family members who lived decades without answers, the community whose trust in its institutions was shaken by investigative failures. Victor Hale sits today in a Texas prison, an elderly man facing the remainder of his life behind bars, his carefully constructed invisibility shattered forever. Jacob Pierce rests in a proper grave, finally laid to rest with the dignity he was denied for 29 years. Peter Hollis lives quietly, vindicated but irreparably damaged, carrying scars that no apology or settlement can fully heal. And the house on Maple Ridge Drive, where this tragedy began on an October evening in 1994, stands as an ordinary suburban home once again, its floors solid, its rooms clean, its terrible secret finally brought into the light where secrets cannot survive. The truth, as it always does, eventually emerged. But the cost of that emergence, measured in destroyed lives, decades of grief, and justice delayed beyond recognition, serves as a sobering reminder that solving a crime is not the same as preventing the harm that crime creates. Some wounds, once inflicted, can never fully heal. Some losses can never truly be recovered. And some victories, even when they finally arrive, taste of ash and regret for all the years they took to achieve. This is the legacy of the Jacob Pierce case. Truth discovered, justice served, but innocence lost and time stolen that can never, ever be returned. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters, manipulators, and trolls won't subscribe. If you believe people should be treated fairly, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you're not siding with the bully.